Section 10 of Further Chronicles of Avonlea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Further Chronicles of Avonlea by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 5. The Dream Child, Part 2. One day, on a dull, drowsy afternoon, the Dream Child called. I knew then that the end was near. The end had been near in the old grandmother's case 60 years before, when the Dream Child called in the day. The doctor looked graver than ever when I told him, and said that the time had come when I must have help in my task. I could not watch by day and night. Unless I had assistance, I would break down. I did not think that I should. Love is stronger than that. And on one thing I was determined: they should never take my wife from me. No restraint sterner than a husband's loving hand should ever be put upon her, my pretty, piteous darling. I never spoke of the Dream Child to her. The doctor advised against it. It would, he said, only serve to deepen the delusion. When he hinted at an asylum, I gave him a look that would have been a fierce word for another man. He never spoke of it again. One night in August there was a dull, murky sunset after a dead, breathless day of heat, with not a wind stirring. The sea was not as blue as the sea should be, but pink, all pink, a ghastly, staring, painted pink. I lingered in the harbor shore below the house until dark. The evening bells were ringing faintly and mournfully in a church across the harbor. Behind me in the kitchen I heard my wife singing. Sometimes now her spirits were fitfully high, and then she would sing the old songs of her girlhood. But even in her singing was something strange, as if a wailing, unearthly cry rang through it. Nothing about her was sadder than that strange singing. When I went back to the house the rain was beginning to fall, but there was no wind or sound in the air, only that dismal stillness, as if the world were holding its breath in expectation of a calamity. Josie was standing by the window, looking out and listening. I tried to induce her to go to bed, but she only shook her head. "I might fall asleep and not hear him when he called," she said. "I am always afraid to sleep now, for fear he should call and his mother fail to hear him." Knowing it was of no use to entreat, I sat down by the table and tried to read. 3 hours passed on. When the clock struck midnight she started up, with the wild light in her sunken blue eyes. "He is calling!" she cried. "Calling out there in the storm. Yes, yes, sweet, I'm coming." She opened the door and fled down the path to the shore. I snatched a lantern from the wall, lighted it, and followed. It was the blackest night I was ever out in, dark with the very darkness of death. The rain fell thickly and heavily. I overtook Josie, caught her hand, and stumbled along in her wake, for she went with the speed and recklessness of a distraught woman. We moved in the little flitting circle of light shed by the lantern. All around us and above us was a horrible, voiceless darkness, held, as it were, at bay by the friendly light. "If I could only overtake him once," moaned Josie. "If I could just kiss him once, and hold him close against my aching heart. This pain that never leaves me would leave me then. Oh, my pretty boy, wait for Mother. I am coming to you. Listen, David, he cries so pitifully. Listen, can't you hear it?" I did hear it. Clear and distinct, out of the deadly still darkness before us came a faint, wailing cry. What was it? Was I too going mad, or was there something out there, something that cried and moaned, longing for human love, yet ever retreating from human footsteps? I am not a superstitious man, but my nerve had been shaken by my long trial, and I was weaker than I thought. Terror took possession of me, terror unnameable. I trembled in every limb, clammy perspiration oozed from my forehead. I was possessed by a wild impulse to turn and flee, anywhere away from that unearthly cry. But Josephine's cold hand gripped mine firmly and led me on. The strange cry still rang in my ears. But it did not recede. It sounded clearer and stronger. It was a wail, but a loud, insistent wail. It was nearer, nearer. It was in the darkness just beyond us. Then we came to it. A little dory had been beached on the pebbles and left there by the receding tide. There was a child in it, a boy of perhaps 2 years old, who crouched in the bottom of the dory in water to his waist, his big blue eyes wild and wide with terror, his face white and tear-stained. He wailed again when he saw us, and held out his little hands. My horror fell away from me like a discarded garment. This child was living. How he had come there, whence and why, I did not know, and in my state of mind did not question. It was no cry of parted spirit I had heard. That was enough for me. "Oh, the poor darling!" cried my wife. She stooped over the dory and lifted the baby in her arms. His long fair curls fell on her shoulder. She hid her face against his and wrapped her shawl around him. "Let me carry him, dear," I said. "He is very wet and too heavy for you." "No, no, I must carry him. My arms have been so empty. They are full now. Oh, David, the pain at my heart has gone. He has come to me to take the place of my own. God has sent him to me out of the sea. He is wet and cold and tired. Hush, sweet one, we will go home." Silently I followed her home. The wind was rising, coming in sudden angry gusts. The storm was at hand, but we reached shelter before it broke. Just as I shut our door behind us, it smote the house with the roar of a baffled beast. I thanked God that we were not out in it, following the dream child. "You are very wet, Josie," I said. "Go and put on dry clothes at once." "The child must be looked to first," she said firmly. "See how chilled and exhausted he is, the pretty dear. Light a fire quickly, David, while I get dry things for him." I let her have her way. She brought out the clothes our own child had worn and dressed the waif in them, rubbing his chilled limbs, brushing his wet hair, laughing over him, mothering him. She seemed like her old self. For my own part I was bewildered. All the questions I had not asked before came crowding to my mind now. Whose child was this? Whence had he come? What was the meaning of it all? He was a pretty baby, fair and plump and rosy. When he was dried and fed, he fell asleep in Josie's arms. She hung over him in a passion of delight. It was with difficulty I persuaded her to leave him long enough to change her wet clothes. She never asked whose he might be or from where he might have come. He had been sent to her from the sea. The dream child had led her to him. That was what she believed, and I dared not throw any doubt on that belief. She slept that night with the baby on her arm, and in her sleep her face was the face of a girl in her youth, untroubled and unworn. I expected that the morrow would bring someone seeking the baby. I had come to the conclusion that he must belong to the cove across the harbor, where the fishing hamlet was, and all day, while Josie laughed and played with him, I waited and listened for the footsteps of those who would come seeking him. But they did not come. Day after day passed, and still they did not come. I was in a maze of perplexity. What should I do? I shrank from the thought of the boy being taken away from us. Since we had found him, the dream child had never called. My wife seemed to have turned back from the dark borderland where her feet had strayed to walk again with me in our own homely paths. Day and night she was her old bright self, happy and serene in the new motherhood that had come to her. The only thing strange in her was her calm acceptance of the event. She never wondered who or whose the child might be, never seemed to fear that he would be taken from her, and she gave him our dream child's name. At last, when a full week had passed, I went in my bewilderment to our old doctor. "A most extraordinary thing," he said thoughtfully. "The child, as you say, must belong to the Spruce Cove people. Yet it is an almost unbelievable thing that there has been no search or inquiry after him. Probably there is some simple explanation of the mystery, however. I advise you to go over to the cove and inquire. When you find the parents or guardian of the child, ask them to allow you to keep it for a time. It may prove your wife's salvation. I have known such cases. Evidently on that night the crisis of her mental disorder was reached. A little thing might have sufficed to turn her feet either way, back to reason and sanity or into deeper darkness. It is my belief that the former has occurred, and that, if she is left in an undisturbed possession of this child for a time, She will recover completely. I drove around the harbor that day with a lighter heart than I had ever hoped to possess again. When I reached Spruce Cove, the first person I met was old Abel Blair. I asked him if any child were missing from the cove or along shore. He looked at me in surprise, shook his head, and said he had not heard of any. I told him as much of the tale as was necessary, leaving him to think that my wife and I had found the dory and its small passenger during an ordinary walk along the shore. "A green dory!" he exclaimed. "Ben Forbes's old green dory has been missing for a week, but it was so rotten and leaky he didn't bother looking for it. But this child, sir, it beats me. What might he be like?" I described the child as closely as possible. "That fits little Harry Martin to a hair," said old Abel perplexedly, "but, sir, it can't be. Or if it is, there's been foul work somewhere. James Martin's wife died last winter, sir, and he died the next month. They left a baby and not much else. There weren't nobody to take the child but Jim's half-sister, Maggie Fleming. She lived here at the cove, and I'm sorry to say, sir, she hadn't too good a name. She didn't want to be bothered with the baby, and folks say she neglected him scandalous. Well, last spring she began talking of going away to the States. She said a friend of hers had got her a good place in Boston, and she was going to go and take little Harry. We supposed it was all right. Last Saturday she went, sir. She was going to walk to the station, and the last seen of her she was trudging along the road carrying the baby. It hasn't been thought of since. But, sir, do you suppose that she set that innocent child adrift in that old leaky dory to send him to his death? I knew Maggie was no better than she should be, but I can't believe she was as bad as that." "You must come over with me and see if you can identify the child," I said. "If he is Harry Martin, I shall keep him. My wife has been very lonely since our baby died, and she has taken a fancy to this little chap." When we reached my home, old Abel recognized the child as Harry Martin. He is with us still. His baby hands led my dear wife back to health and happiness. Other children have come to us. She loves them all dearly, but the boy who bears her dead son's name is to her, aye, and to me, as dear as if she had given him birth. He came from the sea, and at his coming the ghostly dream-child fled, never more to lure my wife away from me with its exciting cry. Therefore I look upon him and love him as my firstborn. End of section 10.